What if one careless word could shatter lives, expose hidden corruption, and ignite a fire no one could contain? In the golden glow of a lavish dinner, beneath crystal chandeliers and hushed laughter, a politician's venomous insult turned a quiet servant into the center of a storm. To him, she was trash. To her, it was a wound that carried centuries of pain. But to the governor's wife, watching in silence, it was the moment she chose war. The mansion stood like a jewel on the hill, every window ablaze with golden light. From the outside, it was perfection, a postcard image of prosperity, elegance, and order. But inside, beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the polished marble floors, the air carried something sharp, unspoken, and dangerous. The grand dining hall was alive with voices. Politicians and donors leaned close over candlelit tables, their laughter a little too loud, their smiles stretched thin, as though they knew every word spoken might one day be quoted against them. Crystal glasses clinked, forks tapped porcelain, and beneath the surface of luxury there was the faint hum of tension, like a storm biding its time. Grace moved quietly among them, her footsteps almost soundless on the marble. She had worked these halls for years, her presence invisible by design. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back, her hands steady as she carried tray after tray. To most, she was just part of the scenery, like the chandeliers or the paintings on the walls. But inside she carried the heavy weight of every glance, every whisper that reminded her of her place. She remembered her mother's voice whenever she tied her apron. Dignity is yours, no matter how they try to strip it away. Don't let them see you bend. Grace lived by those words, swallowing down her anger, wearing silence as a shield. Tonight, though, the air felt different. Congressman Hale was at the table, a man who loved being noticed. His voice carried over the others, booming and brash, punctuated by the smug laugh of someone who believed the world existed for his pleasure. His eyes, sharp and mean, searched for targets, the way a hawk searches for prey. Grace felt it before it happened, the way his stare clung to her as she passed. She kept her eyes lowered, her tray balanced perfectly, but the heat of his attention prickled her skin. Then, as she leaned ever so slightly to adjust a plate beside him, his chair scraped loudly against the marble. His lips curled into a sneer. "Watch yourself," he spat, his words slurred with wine. Then louder, for everyone to hear, he added with a smirk, "Trash shouldn't be allowed this close to the table." The word fell like a stone into the room. Laughter died mid-breath. Forks paused in the air. The clinking of glasses ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were ashamed. Grace froze, her body rigid, her tray trembling ever so slightly in her grip. The word echoed inside her chest, tearing open wounds that had never truly healed. Trash. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the shadows. But she couldn't move. Not yet. Some guests stared down at their plates, pretending they hadn't heard. Others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward Hale and then away, unwilling to challenge him. The governor sat stiffly, his jaw tightening, but his lips sealed shut. Politics had taught him that silence was safer than confrontation. But there was one pair of eyes that did not look away. Eleanor, the governor's wife, sat at the far end of the table. Draped in sapphire silk, her posture perfect, she exuded grace and restraint. But inside her, something snapped. She had seen this before. The quiet cruelty, the smug confidence of men who believed their power gave them license to dehumanize. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She kept her face composed, but her eyes burned like blue fire, locked on Hale with a fury he could not yet see. Grace lowered her gaze, swallowing hard. Her throat ached with the effort of keeping silent. She turned, as she had done 1,000 times before, and slipped quietly toward the kitchen. Her movements were steady, her face expressionless. But inside, she was unraveling. Every step away from the table felt like sinking deeper into shadows. Back at the table, Hale chuckled, lifting his glass as though nothing had happened. "To good company," he declared, his arrogance filling the silence. A few guests forced uneasy laughs, eager to smooth over the jagged moment, desperate to restore the illusion of harmony. But Eleanor did not laugh. She lifted her own glass, her knuckles white against the crystal stem. She tilted it just enough to catch the candlelight, watching the wine ripple like blood in the glass. The fury inside her was cold, controlled, waiting for its moment. She didn't speak. Not yet. But the room had changed. Everyone felt it. The fracture, the invisible crack spreading across the polished facade. The word Hale had unleashed would not be buried so easily. Eleanor's gaze followed Grace as she disappeared through the door, and she made a silent vow. This would not stand. And as Hale leaned back in his chair, smug and oblivious, Eleanor's glass cracked under the pressure of her grip, a thin line splintering down the side. The storm had begun. The door swung shut behind Grace, muffling the hum of the dining hall. She leaned against it for a moment, the weight of the tray pressing into her trembling hands. Her breath came shallow, quick, as though the very air had turned heavy. Only when she was sure no one could see did she let her shoulders slump, the mask slipping from her face. In the servants' quarters, the world was different, smaller, dimmer, stripped of the grandeur that filled the main hall. The wallpaper was faded, the light bulbs buzzing faintly. The laughter and clinking glasses on the other side of the door sounded like echoes from another universe. Grace set the tray down on the counter, her fingers stiff, her throat dry. Her reflection caught her eye in the dull surface of a steel pot. She saw herself not as she was, but as Hale had tried to define her. Trash. The word burned hot, branding her deeper than she cared to admit. She lifted her hands to her face, pressing her palms against her eyes. For a moment she let herself feel it, let the tears spill, hot and unstoppable, streaking down her cheeks. She remembered her father. His broad shoulders slumped as he returned home from work decades ago. He had been called the same word once, spat at by a foreman who believed men like him were replaceable. She remembered how he clenched his fists, how her mother had placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Don't let them take your dignity," her mother had whispered. "That's the one thing they can never steal, unless you give it." Grace whispered it now like a prayer, her voice breaking in the silence. "They can't take it. They can't." But the ache in her chest remained, a hollow, gnawing wound. She heard the storm beginning outside, the low growl of thunder, the wind rattling against the windows. It matched the storm inside her, swelling, rising, threatening to break free. She wiped her face quickly, straightened her apron, and forced her breathing into something steady. If anyone came through that door, they would see the professional, not the woman unraveling. Upstairs, Eleanor sat unmoving, her eyes fixed on Hale. She had not spoken yet, but every second she remained silent only sharpened the blade of her resolve. She could feel the other guests watching her, waiting, wondering if she would break the fragile illusion of civility. Her husband cleared his throat once, an almost imperceptible attempt to steer the night back to safety. But Eleanor knew better than to confuse safety with righteousness. The word Hale had flung across the table had not landed on Grace alone. It had landed on every black woman who had ever walked unseen through those halls, on every silent witness who had been forced to swallow humiliation to keep their place. Eleanor lifted her glass again, though it trembled faintly in her hand. She thought of her own mother, a woman who had taught her the dangers of silence. "Sometimes," her mother had told her when she was a girl, "your power is not in what you say, but in what you refuse to ignore. She set the glass down with a soft thud, the sound small yet final. Around her, conversation stumbled back to life, strained and awkward. Hale had resumed his laughter, confident that the moment had passed, that the insult would dissolve into the polished air of the mansion like smoke. He leaned toward another guest, telling a story about his latest campaign triumph, as though nothing had happened. But Eleanor knew. The moment had not passed. It had only deepened. Back in the servants' quarters, Grace forced herself to move. She stacked plates with mechanical precision, her hands steady though her heart was not. She heard footsteps approaching. The cook, perhaps, or another maid. Quickly, she brushed away the last traces of tears, hiding the evidence. She could not let them see her broken. Yet in the silence between the footsteps and the thunder, Grace allowed herself a single thought. One day, something has to change. And as if in answer, lightning split the sky, illuminating the stained glass windows for a fleeting, brilliant instant. Upstairs, Eleanor's hand brushed across the tablecloth, her nails tracing the edge of her wineglass. Her eyes flicked toward the door Grace had vanished through. She made her decision then. Not tonight, perhaps, not in front of so many eyes waiting to twist her every word. But soon, Hale would learn that cruelty had as consequences. As thunder boomed through the mansion, Eleanor pushed her chair back. The sound of it scraping against the marble silenced the room once more, every gaze turning toward her. The sound of Eleanor's chair scraping against the marble echoed like a challenge in the hush of the room. Every fork paused mid-air. Every whispered side conversation died in an instant. The storm outside rattled the windows, thunder rolling through the mansion as though nature itself were holding its breath. Eleanor rose slowly, deliberately, her sapphire gown catching the light, the silk shimmering like a wave beneath the chandeliers. She did not glance at her husband, nor at the guests shifting uneasily in their seats. Her eyes were locked on Hale, sharp as glass, unflinching. "Is there a problem?" Hale asked with a smirk, tilting his head, feigning ignorance though he knew exactly what he had done. His arrogance filled the silence, daring her to challenge him in front of his peers. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but her voice, when it came, was steady and cold. "The problem, Congressman," she said softly, "is that you seem to believe cruelty is a mark of strength." The words struck like a whip. Gasps rippled across the table, some shocked, some thrilled, most unsettled. The governor shifted in his chair, his expression tightening, caught between his wife's defiance and the fragile alliances Hale represented. Hale leaned back, laughing as though she had told a joke. "Ah, Eleanor," he drawled, "always so dramatic. It was nothing, just a word. Surely you won't ruin the evening over a servant." The word servant hung in the air, thick with contempt. Eleanor's fingers brushed the rim of her glass, tracing the crack she had made earlier. She could feel the eyes of every guest, the weight of their expectations pressing against her spine. But she stood tall, her voice clear. "She is not trash. She is not invisible. And if you cannot see the worth of another human being, Congressman, perhaps you are the one who doesn't belong at this table." The silence that followed was electric. Some guests lowered their eyes, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Others sat up straighter, eager to witness what might become history. Hale's smirk faltered. His cheeks flushed, whether from drink or anger it was hard to tell. He leaned forward, his voice low, venomous. "Careful, Eleanor. You don't know the weight of the games you're playing." But Eleanor did. She had lived long enough in the shadow of men who believed themselves untouchable, and she had decided long ago she would never be their accomplice. Downstairs, Grace stood frozen just outside the kitchen door, her ear tilted toward the dining hall. She hadn't meant to listen, but Eleanor's voice carried through the crack, firm and unyielding. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, her heart pounding. Could it be possible that someone with power, was actually defending her? Her breath hitched as she heard Hale's laughter again, followed by Eleanor's unshaken reply. Something stirred in Grace's chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. Back in the hall, Eleanor lifted her glass one final time, though it was fractured. The candlelight caught on the jagged crack, casting a thin line of shadow across her hand. She held it high. "To dignity," she said, her tone smooth but cutting. "To those who are not afraid to see the truth." A few brave guests echoed her toast, their voices hesitant but present. Others sipped in silence, unwilling to defy Hale, but equally unwilling to oppose Eleanor. Hale slammed his glass onto the table, the wine sloshing over the rim. His jaw tightened, but he forced a grin, masking his fury. "To dignity," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The storm outside roared, lightning streaking across the sky. Grace closed her eyes, whispering her mother's words again. "Don't let them take your dignity, and into Peking." Hat charged silence as Eleanor lowered her glass and returned to her seat. The lines were drawn. No one said it aloud, but everyone in the room understood. This was no longer just a dinner. It was the beginning of a war. As thunder rattled the walls, the governor himself stood, his face pale, his lips parting as though to speak. The question that gripped the room was simple. Would he stand with his wife, or with Hale? The storm outside had gathered its full strength by the time Grace slipped into the narrow corridor that led to the servants' wing. The mansion's laughter and polished conversation were muffled now, reduced to a distant hum behind heavy doors. Here, the walls were plain, the light softer, shadows clinging to corners, as though the house itself wished to hide this side of its life. Grace walked slowly, her steps unsteady. The air smelled faintly of polish, soap, and the lingering warmth of cooked food that had already been forgotten upstairs. Her hands, still trembling from the weight of Hale's words, brushed against the wooden paneling as though she needed its solidness to keep her upright. When she reached the small room that served as her refuge, she closed the door gently and leaned against it, her back pressed to the wood. The silence swallowed her whole. For a heartbeat she held herself together. Then her body betrayed her. The tears came fast, unchecked, searing down her cheeks. Her breath hitched, her shoulders shook, and she sank onto the edge of her narrow bed as though the strength had been ripped out of her. The word replayed again and again in her head, sharp as glass. Trash. Not the first time she had heard it, not the first time someone had tried to reduce her to something disposable, but somehow, tonight, it had cut deeper. Maybe because it was so public. Maybe because it reminded her of wounds she thought she had learned to bury. She remembered her childhood home, a tiny wooden house at the edge of town, where her father returned each evening with weary eyes. He was a proud man, gentle with her mother, tender with her, but hardened by years of being treated as less. She had been just 7 when she first saw him humiliated. Her supervisor at the mill had spat the same word at him, throwing his lunch pail to the ground. Grace had stood frozen as her father picked it up without a word. That night, she had asked him why he didn't fight back. Her father had knelt in front of her, his calloused hands on her small shoulders. "Because sometimes, Gracie, they don't want to fight fair. They want you to break so they can say they were right all along. You hold your head high. You let them choke on their own hate. That's the fight we fight." Even then she had seen the pain flicker in his eyes. Even then she had known his silence was not weakness, but a sacrifice. He carried that humiliation so she wouldn't have to. And yet here she was, decades later, sitting on the edge of her bed, with the same word burning her. Grace pulled off her apron, folding it neatly on the bed beside her. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, the white cotton now stained by sweat from the long evening. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper through the storm outside. Dignity. Always dignity. But dignity felt heavy tonight. Dignity felt like a mountain pressing down on her ribs, demanding she carry the weight of composure even when her spirit wanted to scream. She curled her hands into fists. "Why does it never end?" she whispered into the empty room. Her voice cracked, fragile, breaking in the silence. Why do they get to keep doing this? A gust of wind rattled the window. The rain beat against the glass like restless fingers. Somewhere deep inside her, a small ember glowed. Anger, raw and sharp. It wasn't yet a flame, but it refused to be smothered. Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand. She rose. He walked to the small mirror nailed crookedly to the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes red-rimmed, cheeks streaked with tears, but still standing. She touched the glass as though to remind herself she was real, not what Hale had named her. And as thunder cracked like a whip in the distance, she whispered to her reflection, "You are not trash. You never were." The words trembled out of her, but in them was the faintest pulse of defiance, a beginning she did not yet understand. Upstairs the dinner had resumed, though its rhythm was broken. The laughter felt thinner, the conversations forced, as though every guest was pretending not to hear the thunder outside or the fracture that had split the evening in two. Hale held court still, his booming voice filling the air, but beneath it was a current of unease. His arrogance had not dimmed, but the sting of Eleanor's words lingered, invisible, yet undeniable. At the far end of the table, Eleanor sat in stillness. Her fork touched nothing. Her wineglass remained untouched. To anyone watching, she seemed the perfect image of composure. But beneath her calm exterior, fury churned. She heard every laugh Hale forced, every sycophantic murmur of agreement. Each one stoked the fire already burning inside her. Her husband glanced at her from time to time, his brow furrowed with the unspoken plea of a man who wanted peace at any cost. Eleanor did not return his gaze. She was not in the mood for compromise tonight. Her mind replayed the moment in jagged fragments. Grace standing so still, Hale's sneer, the way the word trash had slithered into the air and settled like poison. Eleanor had seen too many such moments over the years, moments when cruelty was dressed as humor, when injustice was disguised as power. She had learned the art of silence, of endurance. But tonight, watching Grace retreat with her head bowed, she felt something shift. It wasn't just about one insult. It was about all the insults she had seen swallowed, all the wounds left unseen in the shadows of power, and Eleanor realized she could not stand by any longer. She placed her napkin gently on the table, the linen soft against her palm, and rose from her chair once more. But this time she did not speak. She simply left. The eyes of the guests followed her as she moved, her gown trailing like a shadow of defiance. Downstairs, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the storm. She had tried to steady her breath, but her chest still ached. The echo of Hale's voice lingered in her mind, pressing against her ribs like a bruise. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly as if to soothe the wound. And then, softly, she heard footsteps. Light, deliberate, descending the back staircase. She stiffened, quickly wiping her face, straightening her posture. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to see her undone. The door creaked open. Eleanor stood there, framed by the dim light of the corridor. Her sapphire gown seemed out of place in the plain, narrow space, yet she looked as though she belonged there more than in the glittering hall above. Grace rose quickly, her hands brushing at her apron as though to erase the evidence of her trembling. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice low, cautious. Eleanor closed the door behind her, shutting out the echoes of the party. For a moment the two women simply looked at each other, the servant and the governor's wife, worlds apart yet bound by something raw and unspoken. "I heard what he said," Eleanor whispered. Her voice carried no pity, only truth. "And I will not let it stand." Grace's lips parted, but no words came. She had braced herself for silence, for dismissal, for the familiar rhythm of pain ignored. Instead, she was met with defiance that was not hers alone. Her eyes burned again, but this time with something dangerously close to hope. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "Do not carry his words, Grace. They are his shame, not yours." The storm rumbled outside, shaking the glass in the window. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight, but her chest loosened just slightly. She wanted to believe Eleanor, wanted to let those words wrap around her like armor. But wounds that deep do not heal in a moment. Still, for the first time in a long time, she felt less alone. As Eleanor placed a steadying hand on Grace's shoulder, a knock echoed faintly from the corridor outside. Someone else was coming, someone who might not understand what was happening in that small, fragile moment of solidarity. The knock was soft at first, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the narrow room it sounded like a thunderclap. Grace froze. Her breath caught halfway between her lungs and her lips. Eleanor's hand remained steady on her shoulder, yet her eyes flicked to the door, sharp, alert. Another knock followed, louder this time. Whoever stood outside was not simply passing by. Grace's heart pounded. She wasn't supposed to be here, lingering in her quarters during service hours. She wasn't supposed to cry, to falter, to be seen. The rules of her world were unspoken but unbreakable. Invisibility was survival. If another servant entered now, they might see the tear tracks still shining faintly on her cheeks, or worse, see Eleanor's hand resting on her shoulder. Such a gesture would fuel whispers, dangerous ones. "Stay calm," Eleanor whispered, her tone firm but gentle, as though she were speaking to a frightened child. The door creaked open before Grace could answer. It was Martha, one of the older maids, her grey hair pulled back tightly, her expression cautious. She paused at the threshold, eyes flicking between Grace and Eleanor. For a moment the silence thickened, and Grace's stomach twisted with dread. "Forgive me, madam," Martha said finally, bowing her head slightly toward. "But Eleanor." "They're asking for you upstairs." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she gave a small nod. "Tell them I will return shortly." Martha hesitated, her eyes lingering on Grace as if she knew more than she let on. Then she slipped away, the door clicking shut behind her. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If they see you with me." Eleanor's eyes softened, though the fire in them did not dim. "Then let them see," she replied. "What they choose to whisper is their burden, not mine." Grace turned away, staring at the rain streaking the window pane. "You don't understand," she murmured. "For you, it's words in a room. For me, it's every day. It doesn't stop when the party ends." Her voice cracked, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. She thought of the markets where she'd been ignored, the streets where she'd been watched like a thief, the countless little moments that cut just as deeply as Hale's insult. They didn't leave scars anyone could see, but they weighed her down like stones. Eleanor stepped closer, her reflection appearing beside Grace's in the glass. For a moment the storm outside painted them both in pale flashes of lightning. Two women from different worlds, standing shoulder to shoulder, their images blurred together by rain. "You're right," Eleanor said softly. "I can never know what it is to carry your pain. But I do know this. Silence feeds men like him. And I will not feed him any more." Grace turned her head, searching Eleanor's face for cracks, for signs of performance or pity. But all she found was resolve. For reasons she couldn't explain, it steadied her, even as doubt gnawed at her ribs. The thunder rumbled again, rolling through the walls. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, whispering half to herself, half to the woman beside her. What if it never changes? What if it always stays like this? Eleanor's gaze held hers, unflinching. Then we fight anyway, because the fighter Self is the change. The words sank deep, settling in Grace's bones like a fragile kind of hope. From upstairs came a sudden burst of laughter, sharp and hollow, Hale's voice carrying above the others even through the walls. Grace flinched at the sound, her body tense again, but Eleanor did not move. Her jaw set, her hands curling into fists at her sides. The storm outside reached its peak then. Lightning split the sky in a brilliant flash, illuminating the room as though the world itself bore witness. The thunder followed, shaking the walls, rattling the window in its frame. Grace startled, but Eleanor stood tall, her eyes fierce. In that moment, Grace saw something she hadn't before. Not just pity, not just anger on her behalf, but something bigger. Resolve. A promise. Eleanor turned back toward the door. Rest tonight, Grace, she said quietly. Tomorrow the storm will belong to us. And with that, she left, her gown sweeping across the worn wooden floor, the door closing softly behind her. Grace stood alone again, the echoes of Eleanor's words lingering in the room like the aftertaste of lightning. She pressed her palms together, whispering into the silence, Please let her be right. Outside, the storm roared on, and in its fury Grace felt the first fragile stirring of something she hadn't dared believe in for years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not fighting alone anymore. Upstairs, Hale raised his glass once more, unaware that the storm gathering outside the mansion had already found its way into the hearts of the women he had tried to break. The dining room had settled into a fragile rhythm again, though beneath the polished surface the atmosphere was brittle as glass. Candles burned low in their holders, their flames swaying in the draught that slipped in from the storm outside. Guests leaned closer to one another, speaking in hushed tones, but their eyes kept darting back to the head of the table, where Congressman Hale sat like a king on borrowed throne. Hale was in his element. He relished the tension he had created, twisting it into a performance. His booming laughter drowned out the unease, his words slicing the air with false charm. These storms, he declared, gesturing toward the rattling windows. They always come and go. A bit of thunder, a bit of rain. Then everything's as it should be. He lifted his glass, his grin wide. Just like politics, the room forced laughter, but it was thin, wavering. Some guests shifted in their chairs, unable to meet his eyes. The insult he had thrown earlier still lingered, unspoken but heavy, like smoke after a fire. At the far end of the table, Eleanor sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Hale. The storm's reflection flickered in her sapphire eyes, each lightning flash sharpening the steel already there. She had left Grace with a promise, and promises to her were not things to be broken. She placed her napkin carefully on the table. The fabric was soft, elegant, but the gesture was final. The scrape of her chair echoed in the room, sharper than the storm outside. All heads turned toward her. Hale paused mid-sentence, his grin faltering. "Something wrong, Eleanor?" he asked, feigning casualness, but his voice carried the edge of irritation. Eleanor rose slowly, her presence commanding without effort. Her gown shimmered under the chandelier's fading light, but it was her voice, calm and deliberate, that silenced the room. "There is something wrong," she said. "You humiliated a woman tonight. You called her trash." And you did it as though it cost you nothing." The words cut through the air, steady and measured, but behind them lay a storm far fiercer than the one outside. Gasps rippled down the table. A senator's wife pressed a hand to her pearls. One of the younger aides dropped his fork, the clatter echoing in the stillness. Hale leaned back in his chair, recovering his smirk. "You're taking his far too seriously," he said with mock amusement. "It was a joke, Eleanor. You know how people can be. Thin skin, thick skin. It's politics, it's life. Surely you won't ruin the evening over that." His words slithered, dripping with condescension. Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the back of her chair, but her knuckles whitened. She leaned forward just enough that her voice carried with precision to every corner of the room. "No," she said, her tone sharp, slicing through Hale's smugness. "It was not a joke. It was cruelty. And cruelty does not belong in this house." The silence deepened. The storm outside roared, rain slashing against the windows, as if the heavens themselves demanded reckoning. Hale's eyes narrowed, his mask slipping. "Be careful, Eleanor," he hissed softly, though his words were meant for everyone. "This isn't your stage. Don't mistake your husband's seat for your own." The insult landed heavy, aimed not at Grace now, but at Eleanor herself, meant to belittle, to box her back into silence. But Eleanor did not waver. She straightened, her voice clear. "This is my home, my table, and you will not spit poison at those who serve it. Not here. Not ever again." Every word struck like a hammer, and the room quivered with its impact. Hale laughed, but it was thinner now, forced. "What do you expect me to do?" he asked, his voice dripping mockery. "Apologize to the help? Lower myself to their level?" The room recoiled at his words, but no one spoke. Eleanor did. "Yes," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You will apologize to her, now." The thunder outside cracked at the exact moment, splitting the air like a verdict. Hale pushed back his chair, rising slowly, his shadow looming across the table. He leaned forward, his voice low, dangerous. "And if I don't?" he asked. The room held its breath. Hale's words hung in the air, heavy and taunting, a challenge sharpened by the storm rattling the windows. "And if I don't?" he had asked, his grin thin, dangerous. No one moved. The governor's aides stared down at their plates, their hands frozen mid-reach for glasses or bread rolls. A senator at the far end of the table coughed nervously, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness. The weight of silence pressed against every chest, thick as smoke. Eleanor did not flinch. She held Hale's stare with an icy calm that belied the fire surging through her veins. For a moment, it was only the two of them at the table, the predator and the shield, locked in battle. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the suffocating quiet. "Then," she said, "you will leave this house and never return." Gasps rippled down the table like sparks across dry leaves. No one had expected such words. Not here, not tonight, not from the governor's wife. Hale blinked, his arrogance jolted by the audacity of the threat. His smirk faltered, and his laughter, always his weapon, did not come as easily now. "You would throw me out?" he scoffed, trying to recover. "Do you know who I am, Eleanor? Do you know how many careers I could end with a single phone call?" Eleanor stepped forward slightly, the candlelight catching the steel in her eyes. "Do you know how many lives you've already scarred with your cruelty?" The words landed with force, the kind that couldn't be dismissed as theatrics. Eleanor's gaze swept the table, daring anyone to speak against her. No one did. The governor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lips parting as if to interject, but the weight of the moment pinned him in silence. Eleanor turned her head toward the doorway, her voice calm but commanding. "Grace." The name carried through the room like a bell. Every guest turned, eyes widening. The door to the servants' wing creaked open, and Grace stepped into the room. She moved slowly, each step weighted by fear and disbelief. Her hands were clasped together, her shoulders tense. But her chin lifted just slightly, as though she were gathering invisible strength from the storm outside. The silence thickened as all eyes turned to her, not with the dismissal she was used to, but with something rawer, heavier. Hale let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, for God's sake! This is absurd." But Grace kept walking, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. She could feel the sting of his insult lingering in her chest, but Eleanor's voice had steadied her steps. "Do not carry his words. They are his shame, not yours." When she reached the edge of the table, she stopped. The chandeliers above cast light across her face, catching the glisten of her skin, the quiet fire behind her eyes. Eleanor's voice broke the silence again, sharp and unwavering. "Apologize to her?" Hale leaned on the back of his chair, smirking as though the very suggestion was beneath him. "To her? A maid? A servant who can't even sit at this table?" He shook his head, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're asking me to humiliate myself." Grace flinched, but Eleanor didn't waver. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm asking you to recognize her humanity, something you seem to have forgotten." The storm outside cracked again, thunder rattling the glass panes. Grace's breath trembled in her chest. She wanted to vanish, but she also needed, to see what would happen next. Hale's arrogance swelled once more. He leaned closer, his voice low but venomous. "You're playing a dangerous game, Eleanor. This little act of yours, it will cost you. Cost your husband. Cost everyone at this table." But Eleanor's reply came swift, sharp as lightning. "Then let it cost me, because silence costs more." The table shifted, the invisible balance tipping. Some guests sat straighter, emboldened. Others looked away, unwilling to be caught in the storm's path. Grace stood motionless, her heart a battlefield of fear and fragile hope. Hale slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "Enough!" he barked. Wineglasses rattled, dishes trembled, and in that moment, everyone knew there would be no easy return to civility. The thunder outside answered Hale's outburst, rattling the glass pane so violently that one of the candles flickered out, leaving a jagged shadow across his face. His fist still rested on the table, knuckles pale against the polished wood. Wine spilled across the white cloth like blood. "Enough," he repeated, his voice sharp, jagged, his control slipping. "This spectacle ends now." But Eleanor didn't sit. She stood tall, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady even against his fury. "It does end now. With your apology." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every guest could feel the invisible scales tilting, the fragile veneer of civility shredding apart. Some clutched their glasses tighter, others shifted uneasily, but no one dared intervene. The storm outside had found its echo within these walls, and there was no escaping it. Hale let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as if Eleanor were absurd, a child throwing a tantrum. "You've lost your mind. Do you think anyone cares about her? About some maid who'll be forgotten by morning?" Grace stiffened, the words hitting her like stones, but she didn't retreat. She stood there, trembling but present, her eyes lowered, yet her body refusing to vanish into the shadows. Eleanor's voice rang again, slicing through Hale's contempt. "I care, and in this house, that is enough." Her declaration struck the table like a hammer. For the first time, Hale faltered, his smirk fading just slightly. He glanced around, expecting support, but the faces staring back at him offered none. Some avoided his gaze altogether, others watched with cautious curiosity. But no one rose to defend him. His power, so absolute in the halls of politics, found no anchor here. And then, from the head of the table, a sound broke the stillness. The governor clearing his throat. His face was pale, his expression drawn tight. He had remained silent for too long, letting his wife carry the storm. But now all eyes turned to him, waiting, weighing. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "This isn't the place." Her head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing. "Then tell me, Charles," she said, her tone sharp but not raised. "Where is the place to defend dignity? Where is the place to tell a man like this that he cannot strip people of their worth with a single word? If not here, if not now, then when?" The governor faltered, his mouth opening and closing without reply. His aides shifted nervously, glancing at one another as though the very foundations of their order were crumbling. Hale seized the hesitation, leaning forward with renewed arrogance. "There," he sneered, gesturing toward the governor. "Even he knows this is nonsense. You're making a fool of yourself, Eleanor. Sit down, before you ruin him along with yourself." Eleanor didn't flinch. She turned back to Hale, her expression cold as stone. "The only fool here is the man who mistakes cruelty for strength." The words hit their mark. Hale's face flushed deep red, his hand curling into a fist once more. He stepped around his chair, his shadow looming, his voice a growl. "You think you can shame me? You think you can threaten me in my friend's house?" "It is my house," Eleanor said, her voice ringing louder than the storm outside. "And you will not speak another word until you make it right." The room pulsed with tension, every breath shallow, every gaze locked on the two figures now standing like adversaries in a courtroom. And then, suddenly, Grace lifted her head. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried through the room with piercing clarity. "You don't have to say it if you don't mean it," she said, her eyes locking her. And Hale for the first time. "Because we all heard what you already are." The words silenced him. For the first time, it wasn't Eleanor's defiance that unsettled him. It was the voice of the woman he had tried to crush into silence. The storm thundered, lightning spilling white across the tall windows. The governor rose slowly, his chair scraping against the marble. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight. But his voice, when it came, was firm. "Hale," he said, the name heavy, deliberate. "You owe her an apology. And if you cannot give one, then you will leave this house immediately." The room erupted with murmurs, shock rippling down the table. Hale's smirk collapsed into a scowl, his power unraveling thread by thread. He glanced at Eleanor, at the governor, at Grace, each one standing against him, each one denying him the obedience he demanded. For the first time that night, Congressman Hale had no words. He shoved his chair violently backward, the sound shrieking against the marble, and stormed toward the door. "This isn't over," he spat. And as the door slammed shut behind him, the storm outside roared as if to say, "Yes, it has only just begun." The mansion was quieter now, though the echoes of the storm still clung to its walls. The guests had dispersed in hurried whispers, their departure cloaked in the uneasy air of scandal. The great hall, which only hours ago had shimmered with laughter and clinking glasses, now stood hollow, its chandeliers casting pale reflections on abandoned plates and half-empty goblets. Grace moved carefully through the space, gathering what the storm had left behind. Her hands steadied dishes and folded linens, but her thoughts were scattered, her chest heavy with the memory of what had unfolded. Every word, every glare, every tremor of Hale's fury replayed in her mind. For so long she had been invisible. Now she was at the center of a battle she had never chosen. She paused at the head of the table, staring at the overturned chair Hale had left behind. The fabric was torn where his fist had clenched too hard, the wood scarred from his rage. Grace reached out, her fingertips brushing the mark as though it were proof that what had happened was real. A tremor ran through her, not of fear, but of something rawer, something like power. Eleanor entered then, her steps measured, her presence commanding even in the weary silence. She had shed the weight of her gown, now draped in a robe of deep midnight blue, yet her eyes carried the same fire that had silenced the congressman. She stopped at the sight of Grace, her expression softening, though the storm within her had not yet calmed. "You shouldn't be doing this," Eleanor said, her voice low, warm but edged. "Not tonight. Not after." Grace shook her head. "It's my work. It's what I do." Eleanor moved closer, her gaze unyielding. "No, it's what they expect you to do. And tonight, expectations no longer matter." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to believe Eleanor's words, but disbelief tugged at her. She had lived too many years under the weight of being less, of being overlooked, for a single night to erase it. Yet Eleanor's presence was a balm, a reminder that she was no longer alone in that silence. Outside, the storm began to ease, though the wind still rattled the branches of the oaks surrounding the mansion. But inside, another storm was brewing. News had already begun to seep from the mansion walls, through aides' hurried phone calls, through guests who couldn't resist the lure of scandal. The insult, the confrontation, Eleanor's defiance. It would not stay confined to one night's dinner. By morning, the world would know. Grace felt it too. The way the walls seemed to vibrate with anticipation, the way even the silence felt as though it carried whispers. She set down the stack of plates, her hands trembling. "They'll come for me," she murmured. "They always do. People like him. They never forget. And they never forgive." Eleanor reached out, her hand brushing Grace's shoulder gently but firmly. "Then let them come for me instead." Grace's eyes lifted, wide, startled. "Why would you risk that?" "Because silence is complicity," Eleanor answered, her tone fierce. "And I've been silent long enough." The words settled in Grace's chest like an anchor, heavy yet grounding. She turned back to the table, staring again at the overturned chair, the mark of Hale's fury. Something in her shifted. Perhaps it was small, fragile, but it was there. The sense that Hale's insult would not be the final word. A knock shattered the quiet, sharp and urgent. Eleanor turned, her robe swaying, while Grace's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't another servant this time. The governor's chief aide stepped into the hall, his face pale. "Madam," he said, his voice trembling, "the press is already outside. They know." The aide's words cut through the silence like a blade. The press is already outside. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, though her face remained composed. She had expected whispers, rumors. Powerful men like Hale thrived on them, but the speed at which truth traveled tonight was staggering. The storm had not even fully passed, yet its echoes had already reached beyond the mansion's iron gates. Grace froze where she stood, her hands hovering above the stack of plates. Her heart thudded painfully, the way it had when she first heard Hale's voice slash the word trash into her. But this fear was different. This was not the fear of being humiliated. It was the fear of being seen. Her whole life had been spent avoiding the spotlight, existing in the corners, unnoticed unless needed. Now, through no choice of her own, she was a story waiting to be told. She could already imagine the headlines. Governor's wife defies congressman over Maid's humiliation. She could picture the twisting, the manipulation, the way her dignity might once again be bartered in rooms where she had no voice. Eleanor stepped forward, her robe sweeping across the marble, her presence a shield. "Tell them nothing," she said firmly to the aide. "Not yet." The aide shifted nervously. "They're demanding answers, madam. Reporters from 3 networks are outside the gates. They say they won't leave without a statement." Eleanor's gaze flicked toward Grace, softening for just a moment before hardening again with resolve. "Then they'll get one. But not from you," she added, her voice lowering as she addressed Grace directly. "This is not your burden to carry alone." Grace shook her head, her voice breaking. "But it is my burden. He didn't call you trash. He called me that. And tomorrow, every paper will repeat it. Every broadcast will replay it. I'll be the headline, not him. I'll be the shame." Her chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes shining with a raw, unguarded pain. "I don't know if I can survive being seen that way again." For a moment, Eleanor simply looked at her, her heart tightening at the truth laid bare before her. Grace was right. The world would not handle this delicately. They never did. The story would not begin with Hale's cruelty. It would begin with Grace's humiliation, twisted into spectacle. But Eleanor also knew something else. Sometimes the very act of refusing to hide could transform shame into strength. "You won't be their shame," Eleanor said softly but firmly. "You'll be their reminder, their mirror, their proof that cruelty has a cost." The storm outside had softened to a steady rain now, but the sound of it against the windows was relentless, like the ticking of a clock. Time was slipping away. The aide cleared his throat. "Madam, the governor will want to know how you plan to handle this. He's in his study, taking calls. Hale has already reached out to several allies. He's trying to spin the story." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course he was. Men like Hale never admitted fault. They twisted truth until it bent in their favor. Grace's hands curled into fists at her sides. She could almost hear Hale's voice already, mocking, dismissive, painting himself the victim. Her fear wavered, replaced by the ember of anger that had begun smoldering the moment Eleanor placed her hand on her shoulder downstairs. Eleanor placed her palm lightly against Grace's arm. "I won't let him define this moment," she said. "We will define it." Grace searched her face, her own breath unsteady. "We?" she whispered. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "We." The aide shifted again, uncomfortable under the weight of the moment. "Madam," he said quietly, "the cameras will want a face. If it isn't Hale, if it isn't the governor, it will be hers." Grace's stomach lurched. The thought of standing before cameras, of being dissected by strangers, was terrifying. Yet for the first time, she felt something else stir alongside the fear. Possibility. Cliffhanger. Outside, the hum of voices grew louder, the headlights of news vans cutting across the rain-soaked windows. The mansion was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, and Grace, trembling but unbroken, realized she might have to step into the light. The night outside the mansion had transformed into chaos. Headlights from news vans splashed across the wet driveway, their beams sweeping over the iron gates. Camera crews huddled beneath umbrellas, microphones thrust forward like weapons, their voices clamoring against the steady rhythm of rain. The storm in the sky had broken, but the storm of public appetite was only beginning. From the drawing room, Grace stood half-hidden behind the velvet curtains, peering out at the sea of flashing lights. Her heart pounded in her throat. She had seen reporters before, though always from a distance, their work directed at governors and senators, never at someone like her. Tonight, though, she felt their hunger. She wasn't a person to them. She was a story. Her hands trembled as she pulled back from the window. "I can't," she whispered to herself. "I can't face them." Eleanor was beside her almost instantly. She had changed from her robe into a tailored suit, dark and sharp, her presence carrying both elegance and authority. She exhaled slowly, as though anchoring herself. "You don't have to," she said. "Not tonight. Not unless you want to." Grace's chest tightened. "But they'll twist it. They'll make me small again. They'll take his word and make it louder than mine. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice lowering to something almost intimate. They can only make you small if you let them. If you speak, Grace, if you stand before them, they won't just hear Hale's insult. They'll hear your truth. Grace looked at her, startled by the certainty in Eleanor's eyes. She wanted to believe her, but fear clung to her ribs like chains. The governor entered then, his expression drawn and weary, his tie loosened, his phone still in his hand. His gaze flicked to Eleanor, then to Grace, though he lingered on his wife with unspoken reproach. "They're demanding a statement," he said flatly. "Hale's already been on the phone with 3 networks. He's spinning it as a misunderstanding." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "A misunderstanding?" The governor's voice was low, careful. "He claims he was joking, that his words were taken out of context. He says you overreacted, and he's framing this as political theater." Grace's knees weakened, her stomach knotting. It was exactly what she feared, that her pain would be dismissed as nothing more than spectacle. Eleanor crossed the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She stopped inches from her husband, her tone steely. "If Hale wants a theatre, then let's give him one, but on our terms." The governor's brow furrowed. "Eleanor, think carefully. We can't
risk alienating his allies. This could cost us everything we've worked for." Her voice hardened. "If the cost of keeping power is silence in the face of cruelty, then it is a price I will never pay." The governor flinched at her words, torn between his wife's fire and the political machine grinding around him. Grace lowered her eyes, her pulse racing. She had never been in a room where people argued over whether her dignity was worth a political career. It was surreal, infuriating and heartbreaking at once. She wanted to speak, to declare that she mattered, but the words stuck like stones in her throat. Outside, a chant began to rise above the reporters' questions. It wasn't from the press. It was from protesters who had gathered, voices raw with conviction. "Respect! Dignity! Justice!" The sound rolled through the night like thunder reborn. Grace's breath caught. She moved back toward the window, pressing her hands against the glass. Dozens of people were out there, soaked in rain, their signs lifted high. They weren't mocking her. They weren't dismissing her. They were demanding for her. Her voice came out trembling, almost disbelieving. "They're here? For me?" Eleanor stood beside her, her own chest swelling with quiet pride. "No, Grace," she said. "They're here because of you." The governor's phone buzzed again, relentless, but he ignored it this time. His gaze shifted to the window, the chants outside growing louder, more unified. He looked at Grace, really looked at her, for the first time that night, as if seeing her not as a maid, but as a symbol of something larger than all of them. Grace pressed her forehead to the cold glass, tears mixing with the reflection of flashing lights. Fear still gripped her, but beneath it, something stronger stirred, something she had never dared claim before. A sudden knock rattled the heavy front doors. The chants outside hushed, replaced by a tense silence. A reporter's voice called through the rain. "We've just received Hale's official statement. Do you have a response?" Eleanor glanced at Grace. For the first time, the decision wasn't hers alone. It was Grace's. The heavy doors creaked as the governor's aide swung them open, letting in the night air. The storm had dwindled to a fine mist, but the chill clung to every breath. Outside, cameras whirred to life, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Reporters surged forward, voices overlapping, microphones raised. Behind them, the protesters held their ground, their chants quieting but not fading, their signs lifted like shields in the darkness. Grace stood just inside the threshold, her pulse hammering in her throat. The threshold felt like a line drawn between two worlds, the world where she had lived invisible, and the world that waited outside, eager to dissect her pain.
Her knees trembled. She wanted to retreat back into the safety of shadows, to disappear. Yet Eleanor's hand on her arm steadied her, warm, unyielding. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor whispered, her tone both fierce and tender. "But if you do, you won't be alone." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the blur of faces beyond the rain-slick gates. They weren't just strangers. They were witnesses, and witnesses had power. The governor hovered nearby, restless, torn. His instincts told him to control the narrative, to shield his career. But Eleanor's defiance had changed the air of the night, and even he sensed the tide turning. For the first time, he seemed to understand. This was no longer about politics. It was about something greater, about truth. Reporters shouted questions as soon as Grace stepped forward, their voices overlapping in a storm of words. "Do you feel the congressman owes you an apology? Are you being used as a pawn in a political game? How does it feel to be at the center of this scandal?" The questions battered her like hail, sharp and merciless. For a moment she froze, her throat closing. She could almost hear Hale's laugh, tear in her head, mocking her hesitation, calling her small again. But then she caught sight of the crowd behind the cameras, the protesters, drenched but resolute, their eyes burning with solidarity.
A young woman in the front row clutched a sign that read, "We are not trash." The words glowed under the lamplight, bold, undeniable. Something shifted inside Grace. The ember that had flickered since that first cruel insult ignited into flame. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling but audible. "Tonight, a man with power called me trash," she began. The reporters fell silent, leaning in. "He said it in a room full of people who laughed, who stayed quiet, who wanted to pretend it didn't matter." Her breath hitched, but she pushed forward. "But it does matter. Because when he called me trash, he wasn't just speaking to me. He was speaking to every person who has ever been told they are less, to every person who has been made to feel invisible." The words spilled out, shaky at first, but with growing force. Her voice gained rhythm, her chest filling with strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I am not trash. No one is. And if he cannot see that, then he does not deserve the power he holds." The protesters erupted, their cheers rolling like thunder across the wet pavement. The reporters' pens scratched furiously, cameras zoomed closer, flashes exploding. Grace's hands trembled at her sides, but she did not falter. Behind her, Eleanor watched with pride, her eyes shining. The governor's expression softened into something complicated, part awe, part fear, but he remained silent, knowing this moment did not belong to him. Grace's final words cut through the roar of the crowd. "Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. And tonight, I claim mine." Just as the cheers swelled, a black car pulled up to the gates, its headlights slicing through the mist. The doors opened, and Congressman Hale stepped out, his face twisted with fury. The crowd hushed. The storm was not over. It was about to reach its breaking point. The black car's engine growled as it idled at the gates, headlights cutting through the mist like blades. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Cheers gave way to murmurs, chants to uneasy silence. Reporters swiveled their cameras, their lenses capturing the man who had turned a dinner into a battlefield. Congressman Hale emerged slowly, deliberate in every motion, as though he owned the ground he walked on. His tailored suit was immaculate despite the rain, his smile tight, predatory. He raised a hand in mock acknowledgement of the protesters, his arrogance undimmed. Gasps rippled through the crowd, flashbulbs strobed. Eleanor's jaw clenched, her posture stiffening, while Grace's stomach twisted into knots. The storm within her flared, colliding with the fresh wave of humiliation his very presence dredged up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hale's voice boomed, his tone rehearsed, dripping with false charm. He gestured broadly toward the mansion, toward Grace and Eleanor standing in the doorway. "What you've heard tonight has been blown wildly out of proportion. A joke. Misunderstood. Exaggerated. Twisted into theatre." The crowd bristled. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Others lifted their mics higher. Protesters shouted back, their voices breaking the night. "Not a joke! Not a joke!" Hale smiled as if their anger amused him. He pointed at Grace, his finger sharp as a dagger. "This is what happens when emotion overrides reason, when fragile pride becomes weaponized. I said nothing that wasn't in jest, and yet here we are, dragged into a circus because certain people can't take a word without crumbling." The words struck Grace like stones. Her hands trembled, her breath faltered. For a flicker of a moment she wanted to shrink back into the shadows, to let Eleanor handle it all. But the sight of the young woman's sign still burned in her mind. "We are not trash." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice slicing through Hale's performance. "A joke at someone else's dignity is not a joke. It's cruelty." Her words carried like steel. The crowd erupted again, half cheering, half clamoring for more. Hale's eyes narrowed. He thrived on intimidation, on bending others with sheer arrogance, but Eleanor's defiance only sharpened the stage against him. He turned his venom back to Grace, his voice lowering, dangerous. "Tell me then," he sneered. "Do you really believe you're the victim here? That you deserve to stand in judgment over me? You, who serve food and clear plates while real people do real work?" The cruelty was deliberate, crafted to cut her down before the world. Grace's breath caught, but something inside her snapped. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Hold your head high. Don't let them break you." She stepped forward, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength with each word. "I am not less because of the work I do, and you are not more because of the power you think you have." The crowd roared, their cheers rising like a wave. Hale faltered, his smirk slipping. Grace continued, her eyes locking on his with newfound fire. "You called me trash because you wanted me small, because you thought no one would speak, but I'm speaking now, and every person out here is listening." The chants reignited, louder, fiercer. "Dignity! Justice! Dignity! Justice!" Reporters leaned closer, capturing every word, every expression. Hale tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow. For the first time he looked unsettled. Eleanor stepped beside Grace, her hand brushing lightly against her arm. Their unity was undeniable, their defiance unshakable. Together, they stood against him, two women, different in station, bound in truth. The governor appeared in the doorway behind them, his face taut, his voice finally rising above the noise. "Congressman Hale," he said, firm and unyielding, "your time is over. You will not insult my wife. You will not insult the people who work in this house, and you will not insult this state." Gasps erupted, reporters scramps, Ling to record the declaration. Hale's jaw clenched, his fury naked now. He took a step forward as though to strike back, but the chants drowned him out. The tide had turned. As the crowd's voices rose like thunder, Hale's security detail closed in around him. His last words, spat through clenched teeth, carried only to those nearest. "You'll regret this." Then he disappeared back into the black car, the taillights vanishing into the night. The black car's taillights dissolved into the mist, swallowed by the night. But the roar of the crowd lingered long after Hale was gone. Reporters shouted into cameras, their voices urgent, electric. Protesters lifted their signs higher, their chants rolling like thunder. "Dignity, justice, dignity, justice!" The mansion that had once been a fortress of power now pulsed like the heart of a movement. Grace stood on the steps, her chest heaving, the rain slicking her hair against her forehead. She had spoken. She had stood. And though her knees still trembled, she felt something she had never felt before.
She was not invisible. She was not voiceless. She was not trash. Eleanor remained at her side, her hand steady on Grace's back, as though to remind her that strength did not mean standing alone. The governor lingered behind them, his face pale but resolute. He had crossed a line tonight, one he could never uncross. But for once, his silence had given way to something truer. Inside the mansion, aides rushed through hallways with phones pressed to their ears. Calls flew across the state, across the nation. Hale's allies scrambled, his enemies sharpened their knives. By midnight, the headlines were already blazing across news sites. Governor's wife confronts congressman in explosive showdown. Black Maid speaks out, I am not trash. Protesters demand Hale's resignation after dinner. Insult. Grace stared at the glowing screens too. Through the reporter's equipment, her name spreading in ways she had never imagined. A lifetime of being unseen had been overturned in a single night. It terrified her. And yet, it freed her. The governor stepped forward, his voice low but firm as he addressed the press. Effective immediately, he announced, his words clear and deliberate. I will be calling for Congressman Hale's removal from office. His behavior tonight was unacceptable. There is no room in public service for those who demean the dignity of others. Gasps and cheers collided. Questions flew like arrows. But he raised a hand, stopping them. This is not about politics. This is about humanity. And I will not compromise mine. Eleanor's eyes softened, pride flickering across her face. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. But it was Grace who held the crowd. Reporters leaned closer, protesters quieted. All eyes turned to her again, not as a servant in the shadows, but as the voice they wanted to hear. She lifted her head, rain dripping from her lashes, her voice trembling yet steady. This isn't just about me, she said. This is about every person who has been made to feel less. Every insult that cuts deeper than it should. Every silence that hurts worse than words. Her chest rose as she inhaled, steadying herself. Tonight, I stood here shaking. I was afraid. But I know now, I am not alone. And if my voice can help even one person believe they are more than the names thrown at them, then tonight was worth it. The crowd erupted again, their cheers swelling, not just for her words but for the truth in them. Some cried openly, others raised their fists, the chant reborn with even greater force. We are not trash! We are not trash! Grace's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of release. She turned slightly, meeting Eleanor's gaze. In that look was gratitude, yes, but also something more. Recognition. They had fought different battles, lived in different worlds, but tonight they had crossed the same line together. The rain eased into a drizzle, the clouds parting just enough for the faint glow of dawn to peek over the horizon. The storm had broken. The night was ending, and with it, so too was the silence that had weighed on Grace for a lifetime. Eleanor leaned close, her voice soft, almost lost beneath the cheers. You were never trash, Grace. You were the fire they couldn't extinguish. Grace closed her eyes, the words wrapping around her like armor. When she opened them again, the world looked different, sharper, brighter, possible. The cameras captured her standing tall in the fragile morning light, no longer hidden in shadows, but reborn in her own dignity. And as the sun broke the horizon, one question lingered in every heart that had witnessed the night. What if every insult became the spark of a revolution?